Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us as we mark this third Sunday of Lent. Lent is an interesting season. It's the season leading up to Easter. And it's a strange time because it asks us to reflect on sacrifice and loss, while at the same time preparing us for the ultimate expression of joy and hope. In many ways, this season is a reflection of what it means to be the church, holding in tension the real pain and struggles that we encounter in the world, with the hope and joy of what Jesus accomplished when he died on that cross and rose 3 days later. This is the tension that we're exploring in our current series entitled As Family We Mourn. And we're looking at through the gospel accounts and recognizing different figures who are mourning. And they're all mourning a loss of some sort, though it's not always the loss of life. And there are different stages in their grief, and we're being guided in our understanding of some of the ways that grief can express itself by the work of psychologist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who introduced the idea of the stages of grief, which others have contributed to and built upon over the years. Now, we began 2 weeks ago when we looked at what some people describe as the first stage of grief, shock. We looked at the story of Lazarus, who became sick and died. And we saw a variety of responses to his death from his sisters, their community, and even Jesus and the disciples. And we saw the importance of journeying alongside those who are grieving, acknowledging what has happened and creating space for hope. Now, we'll not always see hope as clearly as it was on display in this account when Lazarus walked out of the tomb. But Jesus has shown us time and time again that we have something we can place our hope in through every difficult journey. And last week we talked about the stage of grief described as denial, and we followed Peter as he waited in the shadows outside the building where Jesus was facing the high priest, having been arrested. And we watched Peter move into the light, and as people began to recognize him, he denied Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed. He denied that he ever knew Jesus. He was mourning the idea he had of the future, the idea that Jesus would topple the Roman Empire, that the Messiah was coming to bring political freedom. So he denied knowing Jesus. He denied the idea that he might have given his life to someone who so clearly wasn't going to bring about what he expected. Then as the rooster crowed and Peter was reminded that Jesus had said this would happen, he was overcome with regret. But in that moment, he was also reminded of Jesus' authority and power, and that they endured even while he was on trial. Now this week we're looking at anger, and it's the only time we're going to look at the same person twice. We're looking at Peter's story once again, and though this account happens before the passage we read last week, Peter is mourning a different kind of loss. Now last week when I talked about denial, I talked about sports, and I'm tempted to talk about sports again to discuss anger. Again, it's almost easier to use these examples that are relatively low stakes. Mourning is an intensely complex and personal experience. And so finding a lighter example with lower stakes to lead in can be the easy way out. But I talked about sports last week, so this week I'm going to tell you about a movie. Now there's this movie called Crash that has one of the most impactful scenes I have ever seen in a movie. And this is the movie Crash that came out in the 2000s, not the one that came out earlier. And it's an ensemble piece that's meant to illustrate the different ways that prejudice can present itself in the lives of a lot of different people. And there's one man, for instance, who's the victim of hate crimes. He operates a store that's vandalized regularly, and one day the door is broken. So he calls a locksmith who comes to take a look And the locksmith tells him that he can get the lock fixed, but unless the store owner gets the door frame fixed, it's not really going to do much good. And the store owner accuses him of trying to pull a con job, suggesting that this locksmith is lying to him about the door, trying to upsell him or hire one of his friends. He's trying to cheat him. They have an argument and the locksmith leaves. But later on in the movie, the store is broken into again. It's vandalized again. Things are stolen and other things are broken. But this time, the insurance company won't cover the losses because the locksmith told him to fix the door and he didn't. So now, on top of being the recipient of hate, this man finds himself facing losses he cannot cover. He's going to lose his business. He can't believe it. He is in a state of shock. He's struggling to engage with the world. And then he thinks back on what's happened. And he goes looking through his records for the address of the locksmith. It's his fault. He was trying to cheat him. He finds the address, then he opens up a drawer and retrieves a weapon. He goes in search of revenge, but then something unexpected happens, and things don't turn out the way that they're supposed to. It's an incredibly difficult movie to watch, and it's definitely not for everyone. But you can see how, in this moment of desperation, facing the loss of the business he has worked so hard to establish, this store owner allows his anger to take over and to guide his actions. Everything that goes into that moment plays out over the course of the movie, leading up to the thrilling, shocking climax. It's easy to recognize how we got there. And when we read about Peter reacting in anger in Matthew chapter 26, we only have 8 verses to understand what's happening in that moment. But there's still a lot that we're able to understand based on what we know of the people involved and what we find in the accounts of the other gospel writers. So let's take a look at Peter's response to Jesus being arrested in Matthew chapter 26, beginning in verse 47. There he was, Judas, one of the 12, leading a crowd of people from the chief priests and elders with swords and clubs. The chief priests and the elders were right there, ready to arrest Jesus. And Judas, the one who intended to betray him, had said to the elders and the chief priests that he would give them a sign. I'll greet him with a kiss, and you will know that the one I kiss is the one you should arrest. So at once he went up to Jesus. Greetings, teacher, he said, kissing him. My friend, do what you have come to do. And at that, the company came and seized him, and one of the men with Jesus grabbed his sword and swung towards the high priest's slave, slicing off his ear. And Jesus called out, "Put your sword back." People who live by the sword die by the sword. Surely you realize that if I called on my Father, he would send legions of messengers to rescue me. But if I were to do that, I would be thwarting the scriptural story, wouldn't I? And we must allow the story of God's kingdom to unfold. He turned to the crowds and said, "Why did you bring these weapons, these clubs and bats? Did you think I would fight you? That I would try to dodge and escape like a common criminal? You could have arrested me any day when I was teaching in the temple, but you didn't. So here we are, in the garden with Jesus and his disciples. They finish their Last Supper together, and the disciples may be thinking that Jesus is acting strangely. Many, if not all of them, would have misunderstood what was happening, and many, if not all of them, would not have picked up on what Jesus was saying. They wouldn't have known it was going to be their last meal together. And Jesus discussed with them what was going to happen next, and yet, when Judas arrives with soldiers, with a mob, they're surprised. Now, every gospel writer records that Judas plays a role in bringing the soldiers directly to Jesus. However, it's only the gospel according to John that identifies the disciple who reacts as Peter. He quickly draws a sword and lashes out, cutting off the ear of one of the men who had come to arrest Jesus. And Jesus swiftly rebukes him. And in the gospel according to Luke, it says that Jesus held the ear up to the man's head, restoring it. Here in the gospel according to Matthew, we read that Jesus seems to not only insist that Peter stand down, but that he also shouldn't raise his sword again in such a fashion. To Peter, the words, "People who live by the sword die by the sword," those words would not have been an issue. He'd already pledged his life to Jesus' cause. Yet Jesus is saying them here immediately after telling Peter that he should put his sword away. At the very least, this is a suggestion that this is not what Jesus has in mind for Peter. Now, last week we talked about Peter's sense of loss based on his expectations of who the Messiah would be. And I think this is the moment where he realizes that his ideas, his visions, were not going to be a reality. This wasn't going to be an armed revolution. But today we're talking about anger. And the moment that Peter's anger is most clearly visible happens before this moment. Peter lashes out with his sword immediately after Jesus is seized by the soldiers. But even that act doesn't seem like it's quite right as the motivating factor. I think we only need to go back one moment more to what Jesus says to Judas. "My friend, do what you have come to do." And in that moment, Judas' betrayal is exposed for all to see. He hasn't been pressed into this. He is there of his own free will. Do what you have come to do. He is an active participant in this. And we don't know too much about Judas and Peter's relationship to each other, but we read elsewhere in the Gospels that Judas wasn't necessarily the most trustworthy of Jesus' companions. And maybe there were those among the disciples who mistrusted him, but we don't have any evidence of that. What we're presented with here is a moment where Judas, one who's been traveling with them, sharing in the experiences that they've had, getting to know the other disciples, forming bonds and relationships, a man who just ate with them that very evening, betrays them all. And when Peter lashes out, it's random, it's frantic. And John is the only gospel writer who attaches a name to the afflicted party, Malchus. And these people who have come to take Jesus away, they represent that betrayal. They represent the lies that Peter's been told, the bonds that have been broken. They represent Judas. And so Peter lashes out, and I'm sure that a part of this is an instinct to save Jesus. But he's angry as well. He's angry that they're even in this position, and he is angry because of what Judas has done. Jesus refers to Judas as a friend. But I'm fairly confident that as Jesus was taken away, if Judas were to meet Peter's gaze, the words Peter would speak would be something along the lines of, "You're dead to me. It's over. Our friendship, our companionship, our bond, whatever it was, it's done. It's done, and it's your fault, and I'm going to make you and the people you are with pay." And out comes the sword. Now, nobody knows what Peter's experiencing more than Jesus. Nobody knows what Peter's feeling, what he's struggling with, what he's afraid of more than Jesus does. So when Peter lashes out, when he lets his anger take over his actions, Jesus is there beside him. And he stays his hand. He prevents further actions. He gives them a sense of perspective in the moment that they're in, and paints a picture of the hope that still exists. "Don't do this, Peter, not this way. I could have ended this. I could have called down angels, but this is happening because it's part of the plan. It's supposed to. I get that you're angry. I know how you feel. You're betrayed. You're scared. But there's more to come." Now, some commentators point out that by intervening in the way he did, Jesus prevented Peter from ending up on a cross at Calvary himself. He calmed Peter down. He restored the ear to the victim of Peter's violent outburst. There was no fallout. There was no evidence. Just testimony that would struggle to hold up. Jesus recognized Peter's anger. He kept him from going further than he could come back from, and he helped him to see the bigger picture. Now, there are a lot of mistakes that we can make in our anger. And in fact, some commentators have already compared Peter to the church and said that when the church takes sword in hand, it usually shows that it does not know how to wield it, and as often as not has struck the wrong man. Sometimes we act quickly, we respond in our anger, we lash out, and we don't even hit the intended target. But how do we care for each other when that's how we feel? How do we care for ourselves? I think what Jesus does here for Peter is very powerful. He doesn't acknowledge Peter's feelings, just his actions. He responds to the immediate concerns presented by the actions taken. Put your sword away. Hang up the phone. Walk away. Next, he gives a check. Is this what you really want? Is this who you really are? Those who live by the sword die by the sword. That's not how we do things. This isn't who you are. Then he gives perspective. And most importantly, brings in hope. Now, this is a really specific example. When you're supporting someone, it probably isn't accurate to say that you could have called in a legion of angels to accomplish what they wanted. It may sound more like, I know you're frustrated and I know you want to act out. I know you want to do this right now, but it's not going to accomplish what you want it to. It's not going to lead you where you want to go. And then there's the hope. It may be hard to see it right now, but God is doing something. There's a larger story, and this might be one of the darker chapters, but He is bringing us somewhere. There's more. This is not the end. There is more to the story that God is writing, and you're a part of that. When people are angry, when they're lashing out, it can be hard to support them. We can be afraid ourselves that we might get caught in the crossfire. And we can't make the feelings just disappear. We don't have that power or authority. We can speak to the actions, though. And we can work towards a different outcome. We can help bring perspective. We can affirm God's authority and point to the hope that there is more after this. There is more beyond this moment. In those dark moments, it can be hard to see that. It can be hard to feel that. When we're lost in our mourning, it can feel impossible to break free. But that's one of the things that we can offer to each other. We can point towards the hope of the nations, the one who comforts all who mourn, the source of heaven's hope on earth. We're going to sing now. And as we do, I invite you to think about what's making you angry, to think about what has made you angry, to think about the anger of some of the people that you know and love. And I invite you to just bring it before God and ask for perspective. Say, Lord, help me to see through this. Help me to see beyond this, because right now, emotions are running high and the anger is so present, Lord. The hurt is so real. So help us to see that we can find the hope and move through our grief. Lord, we believe. Let's sing together.